The last mistake they'd ever make. The sound of gunfire tore through the evening air like a jagged wound. For a moment, everything stood still. The world seemed to hold its breath. The scent of gunpowder mingled with the warm summer night, mixing with the faint fragrance of freshly cut grass. But to Brielle Lancaster, none of that mattered. Her focus had narrowed to a single horrifying sight. King, her protector, her best friend, the only family she had left, lay motionless on the pavement. Blood pooled beneath his thick fur, turning the gray sidewalk into a dark crimson smear. His powerful chest, the same one that had stood unwavering between her and danger more times than she could count, rose one last time in a shallow, wheezing breath, then stilled. A silence fell. Then came the rage. It was slow at first, like a rising tide. A dark thing unfurling in the pit of her stomach, clawing its way up. Her breath came in sharp bursts, her hands shaking, not with fear, but with something far more dangerous. A deep, seething fury. The officers still gripped their weapons, their bodies tense, their gazes locked onto her as if they expected her to lunge at them. They had no idea who she was, no idea the line they had just crossed. Brielle had spent years steadying rifles in war zones, her fingers precise, her mind sharp under pressure. She had spent nights dodging enemy fire, hands steady as she diffused explosives with seconds left on the clock. But now, her hands trembled, not from adrenaline, not from shock, but from the unbearable weight of restrained violence. One of the officers, a broad-shouldered man with a rigid stance, finally spoke. "Ma'am, we received a report about an aggressive dog in the neighborhood. We had no choice but—" Brielle's voice cut through the night, low and razor-sharp. "He was on my property." The officer, his name tag read S. Wilcox, shifted uneasily but stood his ground. He was on a leash. Another officer, younger, less sure of himself, shifted nervously. We didn't know." "You didn't know." Brielle's voice was deadly calm, an edge of disbelief coating every word. Her gaze locked onto Wilcox, her eyes burning with something primal, something lethal. "You had time to assess," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, but the force behind it sent a shiver through the men standing before her. "You had time to see that he was restrained. You had time to think before you pulled the trigger." A tense silence followed. Wilcox exhaled sharply, shifting his stance. "Ma'am, I understand that you're upset, but this was a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Brielle's chest rose and fell with measured breaths. She knew that word too well. It was the same word used when her unit had been sent into an ambush because of bad intelligence. The same word used when innocent lives had been caught in the crossfire. That word didn't bring back the dead. It didn't undo mistakes. Wilcox hesitated. He could sense it now, that something about this woman was different. Brielle wasn't crying. She wasn't breaking down like they probably expected her to. No, she was watching them with the kind of cold calculation that only came from someone who had seen war and walked away from it. "File a report," Wilcox finally muttered. Brielle tilted her head, her lips curling in something that might have been a smile if it weren't so devoid of warmth. "You think I give a damn about a report?" The other officers shifted uncomfortably. They knew. They felt it now. The mistake settling in their bones, an unease creeping into their nerves. She took a single step forward, slow, deliberate. Wilcox's hand twitched toward his holster. Brielle's gaze flicked down to the movement, then back up to his face. Her meaning was clear. "Don't. You should leave," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Another officer, the younger one, muttered under his breath, "Come on, man, let's go." Wilcox hesitated, but then, finally, he jerked his head toward the patrol car. Without another word, the officers retreated, their tires screeching slightly as they left the neighborhood. Brielle stood there, hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart pounding, her vision sharper than it had ever been. They thought this was over. They thought she would grieve, bury her dog, and move on. They thought she was just another woman with nothing left to fight for. They had no idea. The night that changed everything. Brielle didn't sleep that night. She sat in her darkened living room, Kane's collar in her hands. The house was eerily silent. Too empty. Too wrong. His leash still hung by the door. His water bowl was still half full. His favorite spot on the floor was still warm from where he had laid hours ago. But he wasn't coming back. The grief came in waves, but Brielle had learned how to compartmentalize long ago. She had lost friends before, brothers in arms who never made it home. Pain was nothing new. But this was war. At dawn, she showered, dressed, and walked out the door with purpose. She didn't bother calling ahead. She didn't wait to cool down. They didn't deserve that mercy. The local precinct wasn't far. When she stepped inside, conversations halted. Officers and clerks paused mid-task, their eyes flicking to her. There was something about her presence that made people uneasy. An edge, honed from years on battlefields. She walked straight to the desk sergeant. "I need to speak to your commanding officer," she said flatly. The man behind the desk barely looked up. His nameplate read A. Mathis. "You'll need to file a formal complaint," he said in a bored tone, sliding a form toward her. Brielle didn't even glance at it. She placed her palms on the counter and leaned in slightly. That wasn't a request. Mathis looked up, eyes narrowing as he finally saw her. A flicker of something crossed his face. Recognition, maybe, or just instinctual wariness. Still, he reached for the form again, shaking his head. "Look, lady, I don't know what you think marching in here is gonna do, but what's your department's protocol for discharging a firearm on private property?" Brielle interrupted. Mathis hesitated. "Facts. Your officers entered my yard and killed my dog without cause," she continued, voice sharp as a blade. "That's reckless discharge of a weapon at the minimum. If they fired near pedestrians, it could be criminal negligence." Mathis swallowed. A door opened in the back, and a deep voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Brielle turned to the man stepping forward. He was in his 50s, graying at the temples but still built like someone who had seen action. His uniform bore the name Captain Richard Holbrook. "You tell me," Brielle replied coolly. Holbrook studied her for a moment. He didn't dismiss her like the others had. He saw it, the way she stood, the way she held his gaze. He gestured toward his office. "Come with me." Brielle followed him inside. She didn't want an apology. She wanted accountability. And if she didn't get it, then she would burn everything they built to the ground, unleashing the storm. Brielle Lancaster didn't need to look in a mirror to know what her face looked like. Cold, calculating, unshakable. It was the same look she had given enemy combatants when she had been deployed. The same look she had worn when commanding officers told her to stand down while they covered up another unfortunate mistake. She had never been good at standing down, and she wasn't going to start now. Captain Richard Holbrook led her into his office, the door clicking shut behind them. The room was sparse but clean. Old awards lined one wall, next to a shelf stacked with case files. A flag stood behind his desk, alongside a framed photo of him shaking hands with the mayor. Brielle took in everything in a heartbeat. Holbrook gestured to a chair. She didn't sit. He sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose before sinking into his own chair. "You want an apology," he started. "I want justice," Brielle corrected. Holbrook's tired eyes locked onto hers. He was trying to figure her out, to assess whether she was just another grieving citizen looking for a payout, or if she was something more. "Lancaster," he said finally, "I reviewed the report this morning. The officers were responding to a call about a dangerous dog. They made a judgment call in the moment. It wasn't personal." Brielle almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was insulting. "You mean the way they looked at me afterward wasn't personal?" she asked, tilting her head. The way they stood there while King bled out. The way they left without so much as a damn apology. Holbrook exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against his desk. "I understand your anger," he said carefully. "No," Brielle interrupted, stepping forward, voice cold as steel. "You don't. If you did, we wouldn't be having this conversation. You'd be arresting Wilcox for reckless endangerment and falsifying a report." Holbrook's jaw tightened. "You're making accusations that cold." "Accusations," Brielle cut in. "Or facts. You tell me, Captain, what's your department's policy on shooting a restrained animal on private property?" A muscle twitched in Holbrook's jaw. She had him. He knew it. But instead of answering, he tapped a pen against his desk. "File your complaint," he said flatly. "That's the process." Brielle's blood boiled. "I did," she said, her voice like ice. "I went through the proper channels. And now I'm telling you, I'm not waiting anymore." Holbrook's gaze flicked toward the door, as if measuring the situation. Then he leaned forward slightly. "You keep pushing like this, Lancaster, and you're going to make enemies you don't want." Brielle smiled, slow and deliberate. "Already have." She turned and walked out. But she wasn't done. Not even close. The warning. The first sign that something was wrong came that night. It started as a gut feeling, a sense of being watched. Brielle had learned long ago to trust her instincts. They had kept her alive in war zones, in situations where a split-second decision meant the difference between living and dying. And right now, her instincts were screaming. She sat on her porch, watching the quiet suburban street. It was late. Most houses had their lights off. The only movement came from the occasional passing car, except for the black SUV parked 2 houses down. It had been sitting there for hours. Engine off. Tinted windows. The driver wasn't on their phone, wasn't looking at a map. They were watching. Testing a theory, Brielle stood and casually walked to the trash bin at the end of her driveway. As she moved, she felt it. The barely perceptible shift in the SUV's stance, a flicker of movement inside. They were tracking her. She smiled. They were already making mistakes. The threat. The second sign came the next morning. Brielle opened her mailbox to find a plain white envelope. No postage, no return address. Just a single sheet of paper inside, printed in bold block letters. "Drop it." No signature. No threats of violence. Just 2 words. She exhaled through her nose, folding the paper neatly before tucking it into her back pocket. So that was how they wanted to play it. Fine. She grabbed her car keys and drove. The lawyer. Jared Whitmore's office was on the edge of town, a small brick building that had seen better days. But Brielle didn't care about appearances. She cared about results. Whitmore was one of the few lawyers in the state who actually had a reputation for winning against corrupt cops. She stepped inside his office, and he looked up from his desk, eyes narrowing before recognition dawned. "Brielle Lancaster," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Been a long time." She didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need your help." Whitmore studied her, steepling his fingers. "Let me guess. This about the police." She tossed the letter onto his desk. He glanced at it, then back at her. "That was fast," he muttered. "They don't want this getting out," Brielle said. Whitmore sighed, rubbing his temples. "You know what you're up against, right? Police departments cover for their own. Internal affairs is a joke. Even if I take this to court, we're looking at years before anything sticks." Brielle studied him. "You afraid?" Whitmore chuckled dryly. "I'm a lawyer, Bri. I don't have the luxury of being afraid." She leaned forward. "Then let's make their lives hell." Whitmore exhaled, tapping his desk. "All right," he said finally. "First step, we file an official request for the body cam footage. They'll try to stonewall us, claim it's under review. But if they deny it outright," a sharp smile crossed his face, "that's our opening. The warning escalates." That night, Brielle took King's usual walking route, not because she expected to find anything, but because she wanted them to know she wasn't scared. She was halfway home when the headlights appeared. A black sedan, windows tinted too dark to see inside. It slowed to match her pace. Then the passenger window rolled down. A voice, low and smooth, spoke. "Walk away, Lancaster." Brielle didn't break stride. The car kept rolling. "Don't be stupid," the voice continued. "File your little report. Take the settlement. Let it go." Finally, she stopped, turned her head slightly. "That's supposed to scare me." A chuckle. "No, it's supposed to warn you." Brielle stared into the darkness of the car. "You already made your mistake," she said. Silence. Then, "Oh yeah?" the voice asked, amused. She tilted her head. "Yeah. You should have shot me, not my dog." The car idled for a second longer. Then the window slid up and it drove away. Brielle stood there, watching until the taillights disappeared. Now it was personal. And they had no idea what they'd just started. They should have left her alone. The morning after the warning, Brielle Lancaster woke up before sunrise. She sat on the edge of her bed, running a hand through her hair, her mind sharpening like a blade. They had tried to scare her. A car with tinted windows, a veiled threat in the dark, a letter with 2 words meant to shut her up. Amateurs. If they thought fear would work, they'd never met someone like her before. Brielle had spent 20 years in the military. She had operated in the worst hellholes on the planet, places where real monsters hunted in the shadows. She had fought insurgents who didn't care if they lived or died, men who would rather blow themselves up than be captured. And these small-town cops thought a letter and a car were going to shake her. They had no idea who they were dealing with. By the time the sun was up, she had a plan. The fire starts to spread. Brielle didn't go to the police station first. She went to the press. Danny Ortega was already waiting for her at the diner off the highway. Danny was a journalist, one of the good ones, the kind who didn't back down even when the heat got real. She had a reputation for exposing corruption, digging into things that powerful people didn't want uncovered. And now, she was going to be Brielle's weapon. The moment Brielle sat down across from her, Danny pushed a cup of coffee toward her and leaned in. "I read the police report," Danny said. "And it's a joke. They wrote it like King was a threat, like he was some kind of rabid animal." Brielle's jaw clenched. "He was sitting on my damn porch, Danny." Danny exhaled, shaking her head. "They're covering their asses, but they weren't expecting you to push back." "They should have," Brielle muttered. Danny's lips curled in a sharp grin. "Well, they definitely should have because now we make sure they can't hide." She pulled out a small recorder and set it between them. "You ready to tell your side?" Brielle didn't hesitate. For the next hour, she laid it all out. The shooting, the way the officers stood over King's body like he was nothing, the threats, the SUV, the letter. Danny recorded everything. Then, when Brielle was done, she sat back and whistled low. "Jesus, they're panicking." "Yeah," Brielle exhaled. "And that's when people start making mistakes." Danny nodded. "I'm running this today. Headline's going to be something they can't ignore." Brielle smirked. "Make them regret it." The department feels the heat. By noon, the story had gone live. The headline was everywhere. Local veteran DMNs Jews TIC after police shoot Harris Dog. Department refuses to release footage. The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. People flooded the police department's phone lines, demanding answers. Activist groups started posting about the case. And then, just like Brielle had planned, the pressure reached the department itself. By 3 p.m., she got a call from Jared Whitmore. "They're stonewalling us," he said, his voice irritated. "They're refusing to release the body cam footage. citing an ongoing internal review. Brielle wasn't surprised. "They're stalling," she said. "Yeah, but here's where it gets interesting." Whitmore sounded almost amused now. "I called in a favor with someone at the state attorney's office. Guess what?" Brielle leaned back in her chair. "They never even submitted the footage for review." A slow smile spread across her face. They were hiding something. And now, she was going to drag it into the light. They tried to shut her up again. That night, Brielle didn't sleep. She stayed up, reading the growing flood of messages from people who had seen her story. Some were supportive. Others were angry. Angry at the cops. Angry at the system. Angry that something like this could happen. And then there were the threats. Anonymous messages. "Walk away. Stop pushing. This won't end well for you." Brielle read them all. Then she deleted them. She wasn't stopping. Not now. Not ever. At exactly 2:14 a.m., she heard the noise. A sharp click outside her house. Brielle froze. Years of training kicked in. She grabbed her Glock 19 from the nightstand, moving quickly and silently to the nearest window. Outside, a figure moved near her garage. Someone was picking her lock. Her grip tightened around the pistol. Her blood ran cold, but not with fear, with rage. They weren't just threatening her now. They were escalating. Brielle moved like a ghost, slipping toward the back door. She stepped out, circling around the intruder's blind spot. Then, in one fluid motion, she leveled her gun at his head. Click. The man froze. "Step away from my house," Brielle ordered, her voice low and lethal. The man, dressed in dark clothing, a black cap pulled low over his face, slowly raised his hands. "Hey," he muttered, "let's not do anything stupid." Brielle stepped forward, pressing the barrel against the back of his skull. "The only stupid thing happening here," she said, "is you thinking you could break into my house and walk away." A bead of sweat dripped down his temple. Brielle could hear his breathing. Shallow, panicked. "Turn around," she commanded. "Slow." He did. His face was young, maybe mid-20s. But what caught her attention was the badge clipped inside his jacket. He was a cop. Brielle's stomach turned. They had sent one of their own. Her jaw clenched. "They sent you to scare me?" she asked, voice sharp as a blade. The young cop swallowed. I don't know anything, lady. I was just told." "By who?" He shook his head. "I can't." Brielle moved fast, grabbing the front of his jacket and slamming him against the garage wall. He choked on the impact, eyes wide. "You have 5 seconds to tell me who sent you," she whispered, "or you and I are going to have a very long, painful night." His breathing came fast and ragged now. "Wilcox," he gasped. It was Wilcox. Brielle's entire body went still. Wilcox, the cop who had pulled the trigger, the one who had murdered King. He had ordered this. Brielle stepped back, her mind racing. She could kill this guy right now, or she could use him. "You're going to go back to Wilcox," she said, "and you're going to tell him I got the message." The cop blinked in confusion. "But what you're not going to tell him," Brielle continued, "is that I let you live." His face drained of color. She let go of him. "Go." He ran. And as Brielle watched him disappear into the night, a slow, dark smile curled across her lips. They had made a mistake. They thought they could scare her. Now she was going to burn them to the ground. The war they started. Brielle Lancaster had spent years fighting battles in the sand and smoke of foreign lands, battles where survival depended on knowing your enemy, how they moved, how they thought, how they hid their weaknesses. The cops in this town, they weren't warriors. They were bullies with badges, and they'd just made the worst mistake of their lives. Sending someone to break into her house was the final line they should have never crossed. She wasn't going to play by their rules anymore. Now, she was done waiting. It was time to tear them apart. The cop who spilled the truth. By 6:00 a.m., Brielle was already moving. She didn't sleep, not after last night. Instead, she had spent hours tracking the young cop who tried to break in. Marcus Givens, a rookie, fresh out of the academy. The department had sent a kid to scare her. That told her everything she needed to know. Wilcox wasn't using veterans for this job. He wasn't sending officers who had years of experience in real conflict. He was using people who wouldn't question orders. That meant there were cracks in his control, and Brielle was going to widen them. She found Givens outside his apartment complex, standing by his car, looking around nervously. He knew he'd screwed up. Brielle walked right up to him, hands in her jacket pockets. He saw her, paled, and backed up against his car. How did you? I don't make mistakes, she said coldly. Unlike your boss. His eyes darted left, then right, like a trapped animal. Look, I didn't have a choice. Wilcox, he said it was just to scare you. Brielle tilted her head. Funny thing about men like Wilcox, she murmured. They give orders. They make threats. But the second they feel the fire getting too close, she leaned in. They let people like you burn instead. Givens froze. Wilcox doesn't care about you. Brielle continued, voice sharp as a blade. You're just another expendable nobody to him. If this goes south, guess who's getting thrown under the bus first? Givens swallowed hard. I didn't mean. Save it, Brielle snapped. What I want is information. I know Wilcox pulled the trigger on King. I know they falsified the report. But what I don't know is, who else is involved? Givens hesitated. Brielle stepped closer, her presence towering over him. Do you know what happens to cops who lie under oath? She asked. His hands shook. You're bluffing. Brielle smiled, but there was nothing warm about it. Whitmore already filed for the body cam footage, she said. The press is all over this. The state attorney is looking into it. It's only a matter of time before someone cracks. She took another step forward. You want it to be you, or do you want to help me take down the bastard who's using you? A beat of silence. Then, Givens let out a shaky breath. There's a hard drive in the precinct, he whispered, locked in evidence storage. It has everything. Unedited body cam footage, incident reports before they were changed, everything. Brielle's eyes flashed. How do I get in? Givens licked his lips. You don't. Not legally. They have it under lock and key. Brielle considered that. Then she smiled. She didn't need legal. She just needed access. Breaking in. That night, Brielle parked 2 blocks from the precinct. Dark clothing. Gloves. A bag strapped over her shoulder. This wasn't a random break-in. This was tactical infiltration. She knew the station's layout from her previous visits. She knew the blind spots in their camera system. And she knew, thanks to Givens, that there was a side entrance that had an outdated security lock. She moved fast. Within 5 minutes, she was inside. The precinct was quiet. Most officers were either out on patrol or clocked out for the night. Only a skeleton crew remained. Brielle stayed in the shadows, moving between desks and hallways, her steps silent. She reached the evidence storage room. The door was locked. Brielle pulled out a small electronic device, a signal jammer. She pressed a button. The security feed cut out for exactly 60 seconds. That was all she needed. She picked the lock fast. The door clicked open. Inside, rows of filing cabinets and storage shelves lined the walls. She moved quickly, scanning for the hard drive. Then, there. A black box labeled. Officier in Vigo DVD Shehutieng. TAC hashtag 7456. She grabbed it, stuffed it into her bag, and turned to leave. Then, a noise. Footsteps. Brielle froze. Someone was coming. She slipped into the shadows, pressing herself against the wall. The door creaked open. A flashlight beam swept through the room. Then, a familiar voice. Wilcox. Brielle's heart pounded, but her breathing stayed calm. He was alone. "Dan Rookie's forgetting to lock the damn door," he muttered, stepping inside. Brielle moved silently. As soon as he turned his back, she struck. One sharp movement, a hand over his mouth, an arm locking around his throat. Wilcox gasped, struggling, but she had years of training over him. He thrashed, his hands clawed at her arm. But within seconds, his movements slowed. Brielle held tight until his body went limp. She let him drop to the floor. Unconscious, she exhaled. Then, she grabbed his badge and walked out. The war goes public. By the next morning, the evidence was everywhere. Brielle had copied the footage, sending it straight to Danny Ortega. And Danny, she did not hold back. The headlines hit like a grenade. Body cam footage, reveals Pigoliccovin Dogi shooting. Officer YLC Ocax FABRIKAKD reportees. Social media exploded. News stations picked up the story. And by midday, the state attorney announced an investigation. Brielle stood outside the police station, watching as reporters swarmed the building. Then, the doors opened, and Wilcox was let out. In handcuffs, Captain Holbrook stood beside him, his expression dark, his jaw tight. And Brielle? She smiled, because they had tried to silence her. They had sent threats. They had sent cops to intimidate her, and in the end, she won. The war wasn't over yet. But now they knew. They should have left her alone. Burn it all down. Brielle Lancaster stood in the eye of the storm. Around her, the world was on fire. News stations broadcasting the footage, social media erupting with outrage, and reporters circling the police department like vultures over a dying animal. And Wilcox was in handcuffs. It should have felt like a victory. It wasn't. Not yet. Because Brielle knew something most people didn't. Corruption doesn't start with one bad cop. It spreads. It infects. It protects itself. And if they thought Wilcox was the only name on her list, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The system fights back. By noon, Brielle received her first official retaliation. A lawsuit, filed by the Fraternal Order of Police against her for endangering officers and illegally obtaining department property. She laughed when Whitmore called to tell her. "They're actually suing me," she asked, half amused. "Oh, they're desperate," Whitmore replied. "They think they can scare you into backing off." Brielle leaned against her kitchen counter, rolling her shoulders. "Yeah," she muttered. "Then they haven't been paying attention." Because Brielle wasn't stopping until every corrupt bastard in that department was exposed. And she had a plan. Step 1. Pressure. Brielle knew that police corruption wasn't just about one officer pulling a trigger. It was about the people who covered it up. The ones who signed off on fake reports. The ones who ignored complaints. The ones who let bad cops walk free. So, she went after them next. The first move. She called Danny Ortega. "I need you to do something," Brielle said. Danny, who had already turned this case into national news, was all in. "Name it. I need every internal complaint filed against Wilcox in the last 5 years," Brielle said. "And not just him. Holbrook, Mathis, the whole damn chain of command." Danny's grin was audible through the phone. "Oh, sweetheart, you're about to get a gold mine." Within hours, she had it. And it was worse than she thought. 57 complaints against Wilcox. 17 against Holbrook. All buried. The officers who filed them. Transferred. Fired. Silenced. Brielle stared at the documents spread out in front of her, her jaw tightening. They had been doing this for years, and no one had stopped them. Until now. She didn't just want Wilcox's badge. She wanted the entire department to burn. Step 2. The leaks. At 8:30 p.m., Brielle sent the files to Danny. At 9:00 p.m., they hit the internet. And by midnight, the entire police department was in free fall. Because the truth wasn't just about one dead dog anymore. It was about a system, a cover-up machine, a network of corrupt officers who protected each other, no matter what crimes they committed. And now it was all public record. The press descended like a plague of locusts. The mayor was forced to make a public statement. And inside the precinct, Holbrook was scrambling. Briel could imagine it, him pacing his office, sweating, trying to figure out how the hell everything had collapsed overnight. And then, the first resignation dropped. Not Holbrook, not Wilcox. Mathis, the desk sergeant who had dismissed Briel the first time she walked in, the one who had laughed at her pain. Gone. Briel smirked. One down. Step 3. The trap. The next morning, Briel got a text from an unknown number. "We need to talk." She knew who it was before she even read the second message. Holbrook. She smiled, because she knew what this was. A desperate man trying to cut a deal before the fire reached him. She replied with a single word. When? The captain's last stand. The meeting was set at a diner on the edge of town. Holbrook was already there when she arrived, sitting in a booth, his back to the wall. Paranoid. Good. Briel slid into the seat across from him, resting her arms on the table. Holbrook looked like hell. Dark circles under his eyes. His usually neat uniform was slightly wrinkled. He didn't even wait for small talk. "Tell me what you want." Briel tilted her head. "I want justice." Holbrook exhaled. "You've already got Wilcox," he said, rubbing his temples. "What else do you need?" Briel leaned in. "I need to know who protected him." Holbrook didn't move, didn't blink, and that's when she knew. He wasn't just part of the cover-up. He was the reason it existed. Briel smirked. "You're the head of the snake," she said softly. "Aren't you?" Holbrook's hands clenched into fists. "I can't help you," he muttered. "No," Briel said, "but you can help yourself." She pulled a USB drive from her pocket and slid it across the table. Holbrook stared at it. "What is this?" "Evidence," Briel said, "of everything. The cover-ups, the payoffs, the internal complaints you buried." Holbrook's face paled. "You." Briel leaned forward. "I don't need you to talk," she said. "I just need you to fall." Silence. Then, Holbrook exhaled shakily. "How much time do I have?" Briel smiled. "Not much." The final collapse. By the next morning, Holbrook resigned. By noon, a full-scale state investigation was launched into the department. And by the end of the week, Wilcox had been officially charged with reckless endangerment, falsifying a police report, and obstruction of justice. But Briel wasn't done. Because it wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about the system that had protected him. So she took the next step. She announced her own lawsuit against the department. A civil case for negligence, emotional distress, and wrongful death of a service animal. And when the department tried to fight back, the public buried them. Because no one had forgotten the footage. No one had forgotten King's last moments. And no one was going to let this slide. The aftermath. 2 months later, Briel stood outside her house. King's leash was still by the door. His favorite spot on the grass was still there. But he wasn't. She won. She took down everyone who tried to silence her. But victory didn't feel like she thought it would. Because nothing could bring King back. Danny stepped up beside her. "What now?" she asked. Briel took a slow breath. Now she made sure this never happened again. Because this wasn't just about King. This was about every victim who never got justice, and she was going to fight for them all. Danny smirked. "You thinking about a new career?" Briel let out a dry chuckle. "Let's just say," she murmured, "I'm not done fighting." The reckoning. Briel Lancaster stood at the heart of the storm she had unleashed. In the span of 2 months, She had taken down corrupt cops, exposed an entire department, and dismantled a cover-up machine that had thrived in the shadows for years. But even as the dust settled, she knew the battle wasn't over. Because the thing about corruption, it never dies quietly. It fights back. And as Brielle would soon learn, some people would rather burn everything down than face justice. The threat that shouldn't have been possible. It was 4:00 a.m. when the text came in. A burner number. No name. No signature. Just 4 words. You should have stopped. Brielle exhaled slowly, staring at the screen. The logical part of her already knew what this meant. Even with Wilcox in jail, even with Holbrook forced into retirement, even with the state investigation tearing through the department like a wildfire, someone was still out there. And they wanted her gone. But here's the thing. Brielle had spent too many nights in war zones to be afraid of cowards who hid behind anonymous threats. So she did what she did best. She planned her next move. The ambush. By midday, Brielle was on the road, heading toward the state attorney's office. The criminal case against Wilcox was about to go to trial, and she needed to meet with the prosecution to finalize her testimony. It should have been a routine drive. It wasn't. Halfway there, she caught it. A black SUV in her rearview mirror. Same make, same model, same goddamn vehicle that had been watching her house weeks ago. She forced herself to stay calm, checked her surroundings. She was on a back road, a rural stretch between the town and the state capitol. No cameras, no witnesses. And then, the SUV accelerated. Brielle's pulse stayed steady, but her grip on the wheel tightened. The SUV moved closer, then closer. Then, the impact came hard. Metal slammed into metal, jolting her car forward as the SUV rammed into her back bumper. Brielle reacted instantly. She twisted the wheel, fighting for control as her tires screeched against the asphalt. Another hit. Another violent shove toward the ditch. They weren't trying to scare her. They were trying to kill her. Brielle's heart rate spiked, but not with fear. With pure, lethal fury. They thought she was some civilian they could run off the road. They had no idea they were dealing with a combat-trained driver who had survived convoy ambushes in enemy territory. Brielle braked hard, forcing the SUV to overshoot. Then she did what no one expected. She turned into the attack, slamming her own car against the SUV's side, using the momentum to send it spinning out. Tires screamed. The SUV lost control, crashing into a tree. Brielle didn't wait. She stopped her car, grabbed her pistol, and was out the door in seconds. Gun raised. Ready. The SUV's driver's side door opened slowly, and out stepped a man Brielle recognized instantly. Not a stranger. Not some hired thug. Captain Richard Holbrook. The former police captain who had stepped down. The man who had lost everything because of her. And now, he wanted revenge. The final confrontation. Holbrook wiped blood from his mouth, glaring at Brielle like a wounded predator. You should have stopped, he growled. Brielle cocked her head. I gave you a chance to walk away, she said, pistol aimed directly at his chest. You should have taken it. Holbrook let out a bitter laugh, wiping sweat from his forehead. You really think this ends with Wilcox in prison? He muttered. You think I was the worst of them? Brielle didn't move. She knew corruption ran deeper than one man. But Holbrook had been a leader in it, and right now he was the one standing in front of her. Get on your knees, she ordered. Holbrook exhaled through his nose. I could have killed you, he muttered. Brielle's expression didn't change. But you didn't. Silence. Then finally, Holbrook dropped to his knees. Brielle stepped closer, gun still trained on him. You think I won't pull the trigger? She asked. Holbrook grinned. I think if you were going to kill me, you would have done it already. She smirked. And then, sirens filled the air. Holbrook's grin faltered. Brielle took a slow breath. I don't need to kill you, she said. Because I already won. The police cars screeched to a stop. State troopers flooded the scene, weapons drawn. Brielle slowly lowered her gun as Holbrook was forcibly shoved to the ground, handcuffed, and dragged away. She watched him go, his eyes still locked on hers. Hatred, regret, and finally, defeat. Brielle exhaled. It was over. The aftermath. The charges against Holbrook came swiftly. Conspiracy to commit assault, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice. Between his crimes and the civil case Brielle had launched, his life was over. And the police department, dismantled. A full-scale federal investigation was now underway. Wilcox had been the beginning. Holbrook had been the end. And in between, Brielle had burned the system to the ground. The last goodbye. 1 week later, Brielle stood by King's grave. The wind was soft. The sun was warm. Justice had been served. The people responsible for his death, for the cover-up, for the corruption, were gone. But it still didn't bring him back. Brielle knelt down, running a hand over the nameplate. King. Loyal. Brave. Never forgotten. I did it, buddy, she murmured. They paid for what they did. Silence. The kind of silence that a dog should have filled. Brielle swallowed hard. She had spent so much time fighting that she hadn't let herself grieve. So she did. Right there, at his grave, she let the weight of it all settle into her chest. King had died because of them, but his death had brought the truth into the light. And now the people responsible would never hurt anyone again. Brielle took a slow breath. Then she stood. She had won the war. But there would always be another battle. And she would be ready. She walked away, leaving behind the past, and stepping into the future, where she was the hunter now, where no one would ever silence her again.